there is already a track record of some cooperation between China and the United States to solve a big problem in the Middle East, and that's the Iran nuclear threat. So obviously both China and the United States participated in the P5+1 negotiations, worked very closely together, and were able, with the help of other countries and other partners, to address and resolve that issue peacefully without any conflict and any war. And China's role in the Iran nuclear deal is critical, especially with regard to the Arak nuclear reactor in Iran. Whether they can extend that cooperation to other issues, I think, remains to be seen. As you said, the Belt and Road Initiative may actually offer an opportunity for the United States and China, or at least for American companies and China, to work to address some of the infrastructure needs of the region. And I would encourage the United States not to look too skeptically or with too much suspicion of Belt and Road, and actually to see it as a potential opportunity for the United States.
A fair point. Now, for the U.S.'s policy in the Middle East, where do you see President Trump going? We have seen back and forth, for instance, on the question of the one-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now he seems to have, again, stepped back, but he seems to want to make peace in that region. Where is his policy going from what we have seen so far?
So what I think we see so far is more continuity than we might expect in a few areas. On counterterrorism, Trump was quite critical of President Obama's approach to the ISIS problem in the Middle East. He ordered a new strategy, a new review, and his administration gave him back a strategy that looked very much like the approach that President Obama was taking, so a lot of continuity there. On Iran, President Trump, when he was a candidate, was quite critical, as you know, of the Iran nuclear deal. But so far, he has signaled his intention to remain in the deal, and the State Department has certified that Iran is complying with the deal. Even on Israel and Palestine, which you just remarked on, I think so far there has been a higher degree of continuity from President Trump than we might have expected. He has been critical of the Israelis on settlement construction, and he has welcomed Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to Washington just in recent days. So I think in terms of what they're doing, there's a lot of continuity. In terms of what they're saying, I think you're seeing a high degree of really aggressive rhetoric, and sometimes descriptions of the policy from different senior officials that differ from what the president says. And so I think the concern that some of us have is a lack of clarity, a lack of coherence as to their policy approach.
You're working under former Secretary of State John Kerry, especially during the deal that the United States struck with Russia in dealing with the Syria's chemical weapons issue. Do you think there will be this kind of red line being drawn again under President Trump when it comes to any possible strong action in response to Syria or the Syrian government's any future possible use of chemical weapons?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there has been some areas of continuity where we thought there might be change. There have also been some change where we might have expected continuity from the new administration, and Syria is a good example. President Trump signaled during the campaign that he was not supportive of increased U.S. military activity in the Middle East, that he thought the Iraq War was a bad idea, even though at the time he had supported it, and that he would not get the United States involved more deeply in military conflicts. But as
he did drop the 59 Scud missiles in Syria.
So that was during the campaign. As president, President Trump has actually taken significant steps towards greater U.S. military involvement in the region. The best example, as you indicated, is the missile attack on the Assad regime in response to the use of chemical weapons. But he has also increased U.S. military activity in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and even in places like Somalia. So there are some examples here of increased military activity where we might have thought the administration would not intervene as much as they have.
Let's come back to Syria,
Sure.
because again, we have this meeting that's being held by Russia, by Iran, and by Turkey, where they even signed an agreement to set up kind of a de-escalation zone in Syria. How does the United States look at this development now?
Well, it's interesting. The United States was present at this meeting, but was not a direct participant in this meeting. Its status was that of an observer to the agreement. So I think the American government is still sort of studying the agreement to determine what exactly it says and whether it is a viable approach. My concern is that it is hard to imagine an agreement that can be implemented effectively that doesn't involve the United States, and frankly, it doesn't involve some other countries that are involved in this conflict, particularly the Gulf countries, which provide a high degree of support to the Syrian opposition. I welcome Russian, Turkish, and Iranian leadership in trying to address what is the worst crisis anywhere on the planet, the worst humanitarian crisis and the worst conflict. But I do think it is going to require buy-in from other countries, including the United States, to make this work. There have been a lot of agreements on Syria, and not a lot of them have been successful.
No, and maybe that's precisely the reason why the United States is not involved. I mean, the last time the United States and Russia struck some kind of an agreement, and it again fell through. But how do you think would be a reasonable stepping stone for the United States to come back into the negotiating table, not as an observer? What would have to happen?
Well, one thing I think that would have to happen is for the new administration, the Trump administration, to prioritize ending the Syrian conflict as a policy priority. So far, if you chalked up the administration's policy priorities in Syria, you would have to say that they are focused exclusively on ISIS and on defeating ISIS. That was President Obama's policy and priority as well. But President Obama also focused a lot of time, energy, and attention, and Secretary Kerry in particular focused a lot of time and energy on addressing the underlying conflict. My sense is that you cannot defeat ISIS over the long run as long as the underlying Syrian civil war continues to rage, and it would be good if the Trump administration, Secretary Tillerson, and President Trump started to prioritize ending that war as well.
Do you think President Trump would one day accept the fate of President Assad as the new and the continuous leader of Syria, if there is peace?
Well, we'll have to see. The new administration has said a lot of things about President Assad. At one point, they seemed to indicate they saw no possibility for him to depart. Pretty soon after the chemical weapons attack, they started to say some pretty strong, pretty negative things about President Assad. So I think that this is one of those areas in which a greater degree of clarity as to what the new administration's position is would be helpful to those of us trying to interpret it, as well as to the parties trying to end the conflict.
What is the current state of the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy, let's say the State Department? We have all these voices of dissent, which probably by now has already been channeled properly, but there is also this lack of personnel and the slashing of funding that we have heard talking about. Is that going to affect the U.S.'s foreign policy and also the implementation of the policy in the future?
I think it will affect American foreign policy. What you're seeing is a new administration that seems to value and prioritize military advice and the use of military power as a tool in making foreign policy. President Trump has said, I'm going to give a lot of deference, a lot of autonomy to my military commanders, and he has surrounded himself with a lot of advisors who have a military background or who are current military officers. On the other side of the coin, diplomacy and development have gotten a shorter shrift from the new administration. He has not empowered his diplomats, and in fact, he has left a number of very important senior positions unfilled at the State Department. I think that is unfortunate. I think that is going to make diplomatic follow-up to some of the positions he is taking and some of the policies he wants to pursue very difficult if you don't have the personnel in place to do that hard work.
Finally, you also worked very extensively as a journalist, and you've written a lot of front-page stories. How do you look at the kind of relationship between the press, especially between the liberal press, with the president, with President Trump at this moment? Is that conducive? I mean, we see this fighting, this quarreling almost on a daily basis on some of the TV stations.
Well, I think it's important to point out we have a very free and vigorous press in the United States that has, on many occasions, I think, angered the president by some of its reports, and I suspect it will continue to hold the administration.
And vice versa, the president has also angered some of the
Absolutely, and I think the press will continue to hold the new administration accountable for its statements and for its policies as well it should. I personally have found discouraging, and I think a number of reporters and people who care about journalism and press in the country have found discouraging some of the statements made by the president about the role of the press. That said, the president is a pretty savvy operator. On the one hand, he may be criticizing reporters. On the other hand, he is bringing them in to his confidence and providing interviews and that sort of thing. I think the most important thing to underscore is that a free and vigorous press is essential to the functioning of American society, and I would argue other societies, and that is going to continue.